The morning sun cast long shadows across the agricultural domes of New Terra Colony, and Captain Jake Rodriguez was already regretting his decision to request a transfer to what the military euphemistically called integration services. He'd thought overseeing alien labor assignments would be easier than defusing plasma mines, but as he stood outside Processing Center 7, watching a transport hover truck deposit its latest cargo of war refugees, he was beginning to suspect that explosives were actually the simpler option. Captain Rodriguez? The voice belonged to Administrator Chen, a thin man whose clipboard seemed to be surgically attached to his left hand. Your new assignment just completed medical screening. Standard Nexary female, designation ZR-47, cleared for domestic and agricultural service. Jake suppressed a wince at the clinical terminology. 3 months since the Nexary conflict had ended, and the colonial administration still insisted on treating the defeated alien population like inventory. Does she have a name? Chen consulted his clipboard with the reverence of a monk reading scripture. Designations are sufficient for record-keeping purposes, Captain. Names are optional for integration subjects. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Jake's first glimpse of his assigned aide made him forget whatever witty response he'd been preparing. She was tall, probably close to his own height, with the characteristic pointed ears that swept back gracefully from her skull. Her skin had a subtle luminescence that reminded him of moonlight on water, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style that somehow managed to look elegant. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, deep violet irises that held a mixture of wariness and carefully concealed intelligence. She stood with perfect military posture, hands clasped behind her back, looking straight ahead as if he were a superior officer rather than her assigned master. The thought made his stomach turn. Designation ZR-47 reports for assignment, Master Rodriguez, she said in accented but flawless English, her voice carrying the kind of formal precision that suggested extensive language training. Please don't call me that, Jake said immediately, earning a sharp look from Administrator Chen. Captain, Chen interjected, proper protocols must be maintained. The integration subjects respond better to clear hierarchical structures. Integration subjects respond better to being treated like people, Jake muttered, then addressed the woman directly. What's your actual name? Her violet eyes flicked to Chen, then back to Jake, uncertainty flickering across her features. This unit is designated. Not your designation. Your name. What did your family call you? For a moment, her composure cracked, revealing something vulnerable underneath. Zara, she said quietly. My name is Zara. Nice to meet you, Zara. I'm Jake. He extended his hand for a handshake, which seemed to confuse her greatly. Chen made a disapproving noise that sounded like a dying printer. Captain, I must remind you that excessive familiarity can lead to discipline problems. The integration manual clearly states. The integration manual can take a long walk off a short airlock, Jake interrupted. Zara, are you hungry? The cafeteria here serves something that's technically classified as food, though I can't vouch for its resemblance to anything that ever lived. Zara stared at him as if he'd suddenly sprouted additional limbs. Master Rodriguez wishes to feed this unit. Jake wishes to grab lunch with someone who's probably had a pretty rough morning. And please stop referring to yourself as this unit. You're a person, not a piece of equipment. The walk to the cafeteria was punctuated by Zara's obvious confusion at Jake's casual attitude. She insisted on walking 2 steps behind him despite his repeated attempts to get her to walk beside him, and she flinched every time he gestured while talking. The other colonists they passed stared openly, some with curiosity, others with the kind of hostile suspicion that made Jake's jaw clench. So, he said as they sat down with trays of something that claimed to be vegetable stew, what did you do before all this? Zara had been examining her food with the careful attention of someone conducting a chemical analysis. This unit was involved in agricultural bioenhancement research. Zara was involved in agricultural research, Jake corrected gently. And that's actually perfect, because this colony's crop yields have been terrible. Maybe you could take a look at our farming operations? Master Rodriguez wishes this unit to examine colonial agriculture. Her ears twitched with what might have been interest. Jake wishes Zara to share her expertise if she's comfortable doing so. And only if she wants to. The concept of choice seemed to short-circuit something in her brain. She sat very still for several seconds, then said carefully, I may examine agricultural operations if it pleases Master Rodriguez. It would please Jake if Zara stopped using formal titles every third word, he said, taking a spoonful of stew and immediately regretting it. Seriously, this stuff tastes like it was seasoned with regret and artificial disappointment. Despite herself, Zara's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. The protein synthesis appears suboptimal. That's a diplomatic way of saying it tastes like recycled boot leather. This time she did smile, quickly suppressing it but not before Jake caught the glimpse of genuine amusement. On Nexary Prime, we would say it tastes like, how do you translate? Like the sorrow of vegetables. Jake burst out laughing, nearly choking on his questionable stew. The sorrow of vegetables? That's beautiful. I'm definitely stealing that phrase. For the rest of the meal, Zara gradually relaxed, though she still insisted on addressing him as Master Rodriguez, despite his increasingly creative protests. She told him about Nexary agriculture, which apparently involved bioneural integration with plant systems to optimize growth at the cellular level. Her eyes lit up when she described the process, and Jake found himself genuinely fascinated by both the science and her obvious passion for the subject. The symbiotic relationship between consciousness and biological systems allows for unprecedented efficiency, she explained, her formal speech patterns softening as she became absorbed in the topic. Crop yields can increase by factors of 10 or more when properly managed. And you know how to do this? I am trained in the techniques, yes. Jake leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. Zara, if you could improve our crop yields by even half of what you're describing, you'd solve the colony's food shortage problems permanently. Her expression immediately shuddered, the animation draining from her features. Master Rodriguez should not place excessive value on this unit's capabilities. Why not? Because. She hesitated, then continued in a barely audible voice, because valuable resources are often transferred to different assignments. The meaning hit him like a punch to the gut. She was afraid that if she proved too useful, she'd be taken away from him and assigned somewhere else. In her mind, he represented the closest thing to safety she had in this new world, and demonstrating her true capabilities might destroy that fragile security. Zara, he said gently, I promise you that won't happen. You're not a resource to be transferred. You're a person who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she wanted desperately to believe him but had learned not to trust in promises from authority figures. Master Rodriguez is kind. But this unit understands the nature of assignments. Jake made a decision that would have given Administrator Chen several different types of cardiac episodes. From now on, you're not my assigned aide. You're my partner. We'll work together on improving the agricultural systems, and any credit for success gets shared equally. Partners, she repeated, testing the word like she was learning a new language. Partners, Jake confirmed. Though I still insist you call me Jake instead of Master Rodriguez. That title makes me feel like I should be wearing a cape and cackling evilly. Despite her obvious effort to maintain composure, Zara's smile broke through her careful control. Very well. Jake. Though I do not understand the cape reference. I'll introduce you to Old Earth Entertainment Hollowitz. You'll love them. Terrible plots, worse acting, and enough melodrama to power a small fusion reactor. 6 weeks into their partnership, Jake had learned 3 important things about Zara. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of bioagricultural systems that made the colony's head botanist weep with joy, she possessed a dry sense of humor that could reduce him to helpless laughter at the most inappropriate moments, and she made the most incredibly terrible coffee in the known universe. Zara, he said, holding up his mug and examining its contents with the expression of someone who discovered a new form of matter. "I'm pretty sure this coffee is actually achieving sentience. I think I saw it move." She looked up from the hydroponic nutrient analysis she was conducting, her pointed ears twitching with what he'd learned was suppressed amusement. The brewing parameters were precisely calculated for optimal extraction. Optimal extraction of what? The will to live. Perhaps Jake's taste preferences are simply limited. My taste preferences include a basic requirement that beverages not dissolve spoons on contact. He took a cautious sip and immediately regretted every life choice that had led to this moment. I'm fairly certain this violates several laws of chemistry. Nexary brewing techniques are more efficient than human methods. Zara, I've drunk military ration coffee that was basically caffeinated mud, and it tasted better than this. Your people might be agricultural geniuses, but coffee clearly isn't your strong suit. She set down her analysis pad and gave him a look that was equal parts affronted dignity and poorly concealed mirth. Perhaps Jake would prefer to prepare his own beverages. Perhaps Jake should stick to what he knows and leave the bio-enhancement miracles to the expert. Their banter was interrupted by a soft chime from Jake's communication console. The agricultural dome's environmental systems were reporting anomalous readings in Sector 7, which happened to be where they'd been running their unofficial experiments with Nexary bioenhancement techniques. "Think our little project is causing problems?" Jake asked, pulling up the diagnostic readings. "Unlikely. The symbiotic integration should be self-regulating." Zara moved to look over his shoulder, a proximity that had become natural over the past weeks despite her initial rigid adherence to formal protocols. "Though there may be unexpected interactions with your atmospheric processors." They made their way to Sector 7, where the sight that greeted them defied everything Jake thought he knew about plant biology. The experimental crop rows were thriving beyond any reasonable expectation. The grain stalks had grown to nearly twice their normal height, the vegetables were producing fruit in quantities that bordered on the absurd, and everything had developed a subtle luminescent quality that made the entire section glow with soft, healthy light. "Is this normal?" Jake asked, watching a tomato plant that appeared to be actively photosynthesizing visible energy. "Define normal," Zara replied, but her voice carried a note of excitement that made her formal speech pattern slip into something more natural. "The bioneural integration is functioning far more efficiently than I calculated. Your soil composition must have properties that enhance the symbiotic relationship. In plain English for those of us who didn't go to Nexary Agricultural University. The plants are happy. Very, very happy. And when plants are this happy, they tend to overachieve." Jake knelt down to examine a grain stalk that was practically humming with vitality. "Zara, if this works on a larger scale, we could solve the food shortage for the entire Outer Rim colonies." "We could," she agreed, then her expression shifted to something more cautious. "But large-scale implementation would require reporting the results to the colonial administration." There it was, the elephant in the room they'd been dancing around for weeks. Their success would inevitably attract attention from higher authorities, and attention from higher authorities had a tendency to complicate things in ways that rarely benefited the people actually doing the work. "What if we didn't report it immediately?" Jake suggested. "What if we ran a few more tests, gathered more data, made sure everything was stable before we brought in the bureaucrats?" Zara's relief was visible, though she tried to hide it behind professional concern. "Additional testing would be prudent. Thorough documentation is essential for proper scientific protocols." "Absolutely. Very thorough. Extremely detailed. Might take months to complete properly." "Months," she agreed solemnly. "Perhaps longer." Their conspiracy was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Elena Vasquez, the colony's chief agricultural officer, who stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the enhanced crops. She was a competent scientist but also an ambitious administrator who had never met a regulation she didn't want to enforce with extreme prejudice. "Captain Rodriguez," she said slowly, her gaze taking in the impossible agricultural display, "what exactly am I looking at?" Experimental crop enhancement trials, Jake replied with the kind of casual tone that had gotten him through countless military inspections. Zara's been sharing some insights into advanced growing techniques. Advanced growing techniques, Dr. Vasquez repeated, pulling out a portable scanner and taking readings that made her eyebrows climb toward her hairline. Captain, these readings are unprecedented. The cellular activity levels are beyond anything in our agricultural databases. Zara stepped forward with careful formality. Dr. Vasquez, the techniques being employed are standard nursery agricultural methods, adapted for human crop species. Nothing that violates colonial protocols. Nothing that violates protocols, Vasquez mused, but definitely something that exceeds standard productivity parameters by orders of magnitude. This is remarkable work. Jake felt a growing sense of unease at the calculating look in the doctor's eyes. We're still in the early testing phases, of course. Lots of variables to account for before we can draw any conclusions. Of course, Vasquez agreed, but she was already making notes on her personal pad. Still, results like this should probably be reported to Administrator Chen. And possibly to the Regional Agricultural Board. This kind of breakthrough could have significant implications for colonial food security. After she left, Jake and Zara stood in uncomfortable silence among their impossibly successful crops. The weight of unspoken concerns hung between them like a storm cloud. She's going to report this, isn't she? Zara asked quietly. Probably. And once she does, there'll be investigations and reviews and eventually someone's going to want to know exactly how you're achieving these results. And then they'll want to study the techniques. And the person implementing them. Jake turned to face her fully, noting the way her shoulders had tensed and her expression had returned to the careful neutrality she'd worn during their first meeting. Zara, I meant what I said before. You're my partner in this. Whatever happens, we face it together. Jake, she said, and the fact that she used his name instead of any formal title carried more weight than a signed contract. There are things about Nexury bioenhancement that I haven't explained. Things that might be concerning to your people. Such as? The techniques require direct neural interface with biological systems. It's not just knowledge that can be transferred or taught to others. It requires specific neural pathways that develop through years of training and biological adaptation. You're saying it's not just what you know, it's what you are. In a sense, yes. And that makes me. She hesitated, searching for the right words, valuable in ways that might be dangerous. Jake felt something tighten in his chest, a protective instinct that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the way she trusted him enough to share her fears. Then we make sure you stay safe. Whatever it takes. Colonial Administrator Elena Vasquez arrived on the morning supply transport with the kind of smile that made seasoned military personnel check their insurance policies. She swept through the agricultural complex like a bureaucratic hurricane, her retinue of assistants documenting everything from soil composition to the precise angle of plant growth with the thoroughness of people preparing for either a scientific breakthrough or a court-martial. Captain Rodriguez, she announced, finding Jake in the communal workspace where he'd been pretending to review supply requisitions while actually watching Zara conduct her morning bioenhancement session with barely concealed fascination. I've come to personally oversee the evaluation of your remarkable agricultural achievements. Jake stood with the kind of resigned professionalism that had served him well during countless inspections. Administrator Vasquez. We weren't expecting a formal review quite so soon. Oh, this isn't formal yet, she replied, her smile taking on predatory qualities that would have impressed a shark. This is just a preliminary assessment to determine whether we need to involve Earth Command's Agricultural Development Division. The mention of Earth Command sent a visible shiver through Zara, who had gone perfectly still in the way that prey animals do when predators are nearby. Her hands, which had been gracefully conducting some kind of bioneural interface with a particularly thriving grain cluster, slowly withdrew from the plants. Earth Command involvement seems premature, Jake said carefully. We're still gathering baseline data on the enhancement techniques. Captain, when crop yields increase by 700% in 6 weeks, premature becomes a relative concept, Vasquez replied, consulting her ever-present data pad. The potential applications for these techniques across the outer rim colonies could revolutionize food security for millions of people. Of course, she continued, her gaze shifting to Zara with the intensity of someone examining a particularly interesting laboratory specimen, the key question is reproducibility. Can these techniques be taught to human agricultural specialists, or do they require specific biological adaptations? Zara's response was carefully neutral. The techniques involve complex bioneural interfaces that require extensive training and Yes, I've read Dr. Martinez's preliminary reports, Vasquez interrupted with the impatience of someone who preferred executive summaries to actual understanding. What I need to know is whether you, specifically, are necessary for the process, or whether the knowledge can be transferred to human specialists. The room fell silent except for the soft humming of environmental systems and the barely audible whisper of enhanced plant growth. Jake felt his protective instincts shift into high gear as he recognized the implications of the question. Administrator, he said, stepping slightly closer to Zara in what could have been interpreted as casual movement but was actually a deliberate positioning between her and Vasquez, Zara is an essential part of our research team. Any transfer of personnel at this stage would significantly impair our progress. Oh, I'm not talking about transfer, Captain, Vasquez said with the kind of reassuring tone that immediately made everyone more worried. I'm talking about expanded research opportunities. The Colonial Science Division has facilities specifically designed for comprehensive xenobiological studies. State-of-the-art equipment, dedicated research staff, the kind of resources that could really unlock the full potential of these abilities. You want to study me, Zara said quietly, and though her voice remained steady, Jake caught the slight tremor in her hands. I want to understand how these techniques work, Vasquez corrected. For the good of both our species. Think of the benefits: enhanced food production, reduced colonial dependence on Earth supply chains, agricultural self-sufficiency across the outer rim. Surely those goals justify a temporary research assignment. Temporary, Jake repeated, putting enough skeptical emphasis on the word to make it clear what he thought of that particular promise. Captain Rodriguez, I understand you've developed a working relationship with your assigned aide, Vasquez said, her tone shifting to something that might have been meant as sympathetic, but we have to consider the broader implications. This isn't about personal attachments, it's about scientific advancement and colonial welfare. The phrase, personal attachments, hit Jake like a physical blow, primarily because it forced him to confront something he'd been carefully not thinking about for the past several weeks. Somewhere between Zara's terrible coffee and her brilliant agricultural insights, between her formal courtesy and her increasingly frequent genuine smiles, he'd developed feelings that went far beyond professional partnership. My relationship with Zara is professional, he said, the lie feeling awkward in his mouth. Of course, Vasquez agreed with the kind of understanding that suggested she didn't believe him for a second. Which is why I'm sure you'll support what's best for her continued development and the advancement of human knowledge. Zara moved then, a fluid step that brought her to Jake's side with the kind of unconscious trust that made his chest tighten. Administrator Vasquez, she said with careful formality, I appreciate the opportunity, but I prefer to continue my current assignment. I'm afraid preference isn't really a factor in assignment decisions, Vasquez replied, her bureaucratic smile never wavering. The colonial administration has determined that your capabilities represent a significant strategic resource that requires proper study and development. Strategic resource, Jake repeated, his military training recognizing the terminology and its implications. You're not talking about research. You're talking about weaponization. I'm talking about maximizing potential for the benefit of human colonies, Vasquez said smoothly. If that potential happens to include applications beyond agriculture, well, that's something for the appropriate specialists to determine. The blood drained from Zara's face as the full implications became clear. Her people had been defeated in a war, and now the victors wanted to understand and exploit their biological capabilities for military advantage. The agricultural research had been a convenient cover, but the real goal was turning her abilities into weapons. No, Jake said firmly. Absolutely not. Captain Rodriguez, you don't have authority to. I have authority over personnel assignments in my sector, Jake interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of military authority that had once convinced enemy combatants to surrender rather than test his resolve. And I'm refusing this transfer request. This isn't a request, Captain. As of tomorrow morning, designation ZR-47 will be transported to the research facility on Luna Station for comprehensive xenobiological analysis. Zara's hand found Jake's arm, her fingers gripping with desperate strength. In that moment, all pretense of formal distance evaporated, and he could see the fear and trust warring in her violet eyes. Then I guess, Jake said, making a decision that would probably end his military career but felt absolutely right, we have until tomorrow morning to figure out an alternative solution. That evening, Jake sat in his quarters reviewing escape route calculations while Zara worked at his terminal, her fingers dancing across the interface with inhuman speed and precision. She'd been quiet since the confrontation with Vasquez, but her silence carried the weight of someone making difficult calculations. Jake, she said finally, not looking up from the terminal, there's something I need to tell you about why I'm really here. Whatever it is, it doesn't change anything, he replied without hesitation. You don't know what it is yet. Doesn't matter. You're my partner, and partners don't abandon each other when things get complicated. She turned to face him then, her expression carrying a mixture of gratitude and something that looked like love. Even if your partner has been lying to you since the day you met. The escape plan lasted exactly 14 hours and 23 minutes before the universe decided to demonstrate its sense of humor. Jake had managed to secure false transit documents and arrange for a cargo transport to the neutral zone when the entire colony's communication array lit up with an incoming transmission that made every piece of electronic equipment within 50 kilometers suddenly very interested in playing classical music. Jake, Zara said quietly, watching the displays around them flicker through impossible color spectrums, I think my family has come looking for me. The ships that materialized in New Terra's orbital space defied every engineering principle Jake thought he understood. They seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their hulls shifting between solid matter and something that looked like crystallized starlight. The largest vessel had the kind of elegant deadliness that suggested its designers had considered both aesthetics and the complete annihilation of enemies to be equally important. Captain Jake Rodriguez, former military engineer and current fugitive from colonial justice, stood on the observation deck watching first contact protocols go catastrophically wrong while trying to process the fact that his partner, the woman he'd fallen in love with despite every regulation in the book, might be significantly more important than she'd led him to believe. Zara, he said carefully, when you mentioned lying to me, exactly how extensive was the deception? Before she could answer, the main view screen activated without anyone touching a control, displaying the image of a Nexuary male whose presence seemed to bend reality around him. His pointed ears were more pronounced than Zara's, swept back in a crown-like configuration, and his eyes held depths that suggested he was looking at them from several centuries of experience. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the station's hull resonate like a musical instrument. Sister, he said, and though the translation matrix rendered his words in perfect English, they carried emotional undertones that needed no interpretation, you have been gone far longer than planned. Brother, Zara replied, her entire demeanor shifting to something that radiated authority despite her civilian clothes and terrible hair day, I was conducting research. Research, the male repeated, his gaze shifting to Jake with the kind of attention that made him feel like a microorganism under a very powerful microscope, that appears to have included forming emotional attachments to the local population. Jake felt several pieces of a very complicated puzzle clicking into place with the subtle sound of his worldview collapsing. Sister. Brother. Zara, are you by any chance not actually a war refugee assigned to agricultural labor? Not exactly, she admitted, having the grace to look embarrassed despite the fact that her family had just arrived with enough firepower to rearrange the local stellar geography. Define, not exactly. I'm Dr. Zara THYSS, Senior Research Specialist in Xenocultural Analysis for the Nexary Scientific Collective, she said in a rush, and I volunteered for capture to study human social structures and assess whether peaceful coexistence between our species was viable. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of life support systems and Jake's quiet, "Oh." Commander THYSS, because Jake was fairly certain that someone who commanded ships that could fold spacetime was definitely a commander of something, continued his conversation with his sister as if Jake's minor existential crisis was merely an interesting side note. Your reports indicated that humans possess complex emotional bonding capabilities that could be beneficial for interspecies relations, he said. However, your recent communications have become less scientific and more personal in nature. That's because my research conclusions have evolved, Zara replied with the kind of defensive tone that suggested this was a family argument that had been brewing for months, based on direct observation and participant interaction. Participant interaction, Commander THYSS repeated, his attention returning to Jake with renewed interest. You have formed a pair bond with this human. It's more complicated than that, Zara said quickly. Actually, Jake interrupted, surprising himself with his own boldness, it's not complicated at all. I'm in love with your sister, she's in love with me, and the only complicated part is that both our governments seem determined to use those feelings for their own purposes. Commander THYSS blinked, which somehow involved several additional sets of eyelids that Jake was fairly certain weren't standard Nexary anatomy. You speak with considerable certainty about emotional states that typically require extensive discussion and mutual agreement. Sometimes, Jake said, reaching for Zara's hand and finding it halfway to his, the most important truths are also the most obvious ones. Jake, Zara said softly, there are political implications to this that go beyond personal feelings. My mission was to determine whether humans could be trusted as allies rather than merely defeated enemies. The success or failure of that assessment could determine the future relationship between our species. Then let's make sure it's a successful assessment, Jake replied. Commander THYSS, your sister has probably written extensive reports about human social structures and emotional capabilities. But has she mentioned that humans are also capable of choosing family bonds that transcend genetic relationships? That we can form loyalty strong enough to sacrifice career advancement, personal safety, and even species loyalty when someone we care about is threatened? Commander THYSS tilted his head in a gesture that seemed simultaneously alien and familiar. She has mentioned such concepts, though I confess they seemed improbable. Improbable but real, Jake confirmed. Just like a human falling in love with a brilliant scientist who makes terrible coffee and happens to be from a species we were at war with 6 months ago. My coffee is not terrible, Zara protested. It's efficiently optimized. Zara, your coffee could be used as industrial solvent. The brewing process maximizes caffeine extraction while completely ignoring the fact that it tastes like liquidated despair. Commander THYSS watched this exchange with the expression of someone observing a fascinating but incomprehensible ritual. Is this normal human pair bonding behavior? Absolutely, Jake said solemnly. Arguing about terrible coffee is a cornerstone of human romantic relationships. I see, Commander THYSS said, though his tone suggested he really didn't. And this romantic relationship would continue despite the political complications and species differences? Commander, Jake said, squeezing Zara's hand and feeling her squeeze back, I was ready to throw away my military career and become a fugitive from colonial justice to protect her from people who wanted to use her abilities as a weapon. Species differences seem pretty minor in comparison. And I, Zara said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet determination that had probably led to her volunteering for a dangerous undercover mission in the first place, have spent months learning that the most important human quality isn't their technology or their military capabilities, it's their capacity to choose love over convenience, loyalty over advantage, and family over everything else. Commander THYSS was quiet for a long moment, during which Jake became aware that Administrator Vasquez and what appeared to be half the colonial government were crowding around the communication console, frantically trying to establish their own diplomatic contact with the Nexary fleet. Sister, the commander said finally, your research conclusions appear to be comprehensive. Very comprehensive, Zara agreed. And your recommendation regarding future human-Nexary relations? Full diplomatic recognition, cultural exchange programs, and the establishment of permanent embassy facilities for long-term cooperation, she said without hesitation. Also, humans should probably be provided with proper coffee brewing instructions because what they're currently doing is a crime against agriculture. Jake started laughing despite the seriousness of the situation. Zara, are you really going to end the first official diplomatic contact between our species with coffee criticism? Jake, I've tasted your military rations. Your people need all the help they can get. Commander THYSS made a sound that might have been alien laughter. Very well. Dr. THYSS, you will remain on New Terra as our first official cultural liaison, working with Jake Rodriguez to establish the framework for ongoing cooperation. And, he added, his tone taking on the kind of authority that suggested this was a command rather than a suggestion, you will teach these humans to prepare beverages that do not constitute violations of basic chemistry. 6 months later, Jake stood in the newly constructed Earth Nexary Cultural Exchange Center, watching Zara demonstrate proper bioagricultural techniques to a mixed group of human and Nexary students. The center's cafeteria served what was officially recognized as the best coffee in 3 sectors, though Jake still insisted that anything tasted good after months of Zara's original attempts at brewing. Ambassador Rodriguez, said Dr. Elena Vasquez, approaching with the kind of respectful caution she developed since discovering that threatening Jake's partner carried the risk of interstellar incident, the quarterly cooperation reports show remarkable progress in agricultural development. Partner Ambassador THYSS deserves most of the credit, Jake replied, using Zara's official title and watching her ears twitch with amusement from across the room. Though I've contributed some insights into human coffee psychology. Coffee psychology? Turns out the ritual is more important than the flavor. Humans will drink almost anything if you convince them it's part of a bonding experience. Zara looked up from her demonstration, caught his eye, and smiled with the kind of warmth that had made him realize love wasn't about titles or species or political complications, it was about finding someone who made terrible coffee but excellent life choices, someone who would trust you enough to share their secrets and brave enough to risk everything for the chance to build something better together. Jake, she called across the room, would you like to demonstrate the proper technique for not burning agricultural enhancement nutrients? Coming, partner, he replied, and meant it in every sense of the word that mattered.